Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 45 of my game system design series. In this video I will investigate Napoleonic Cavalry, specifically how did they differ and how should they be based. Well, I must admit I started with Napoleonics before I moved into Ancients. Most of my gaming has probably been Ancients. As a result, I am used to the Ancients concept of different densities of cavalry, with a base holding from 2 to 4 cavalry figures. From my experience with Napoleonic, most cavalry tended to be based 2 to a base, or in some cases 3 to a base, but it's generally much the same irrespective of whether the cavalry was heavy or light. I did, however, notice that DBN has returned to the concept of different figure densities, 2, 3 or 4 per base for Napoleonics. This has left me rather confused, or it did anyway, which is the reason why I've created this video. Should Napoleonic cavalry be based the same, or should they be based differently in terms of density? Of course, skirmish cavalry is always a special case. I'm mainly focused on the standard light and heavy cavalry fielded by most nations during the period of the Napoleonic Wars. Quick caveat to this video, this is based on preliminary research and I've no doubt that there are those with significantly greater expertise on this subject. It's best to view this video as an introduction to Napoleonic cavalry basing. The main purpose was to verify my basing system for cavalry was accurate. As we will discover, my opinion on the subject has greatly changed as a result of the research based on this video, requiring me to rebase all my medium and heavy cavalry. This is annoying, to put it mildly, but I think the results were worth it. Now back to the subject of the video. The first aspect which tends to confuse me was the plethora of cavalry types. While I can understand cavalry divided by weapons, in some cases it was hard to tell what the difference of different types of cavalry actually were. I'll start by covering the types of cavalry commonly used. Let us start with cuirassiers, which were classed as heavy cavalry. As far as I can work out, heavy cavalry means the horse was big and the cavalryman was also large. This size gave heavy cavalry an advantage in compact order, but was generally regarded as a disadvantage in loose order. We'll come back to what compact and loose means later, but it seems to be a critical factor in understanding the difference between heavy and light cavalry. The primary weapon was a long, straight sword, which was able to outreach the swords of most other types of cavalry. A pistol was also carried. The main difference many people focus on was the armoured breastplate called a cuirass. This provided frontal protection against long-range musket fire and against enemy swords or lances, with there being many examples of cavalry finding it difficult to hold their own against armoured cavalry, that is, unarmoured versus armoured. Most cuirassiers also had a metal helmet which covered the rear of the neck. Lunging forward with a long sword exposed the head and neck of the cuirassier. The metal helmet protected against this. There were many variations, the Austrians not having rear protection, that is an armoured plate to the rear, and many nations not even using the cuirass. However, among the French, the experienced cavalrymen knew the value of the armour, and although it was hot and uncomfortable, generally wore it in battle, at least after they discovered what occurred when you didn't wear it in battle. The carabiners were a real mystery to me initially, as they look a lot like cuirassiers. The carabiners were heavy cavalry, thus big horses and big men, although in other armies they were also classed as medium cavalry. Yet more confusion. A carabiner is a soldier armed with a carbine, which was a weapon suitable for use on horseback, that is a missile weapon, or a firearm suitable for use on horseback. Before 1810 in French service, they did not resemble a cuirassier, being armed with a carbine, no armour and no metal helmet. But due to the heavy losses in 1809, Napoleon made them similar to cuirassiers. Thus I'll only cover this cavalry type before 1810, as from 1810 onwards they were effectively cuirassiers in French service at least. The carabiners were armed with a carbine. As far as I can work out, a strong, straight sword and perhaps a pistol. No armour was worn. In the past they acted as a form of missile-armed cavalry, but during the Napoleonic Wars were a sort of heavy or medium cavalry, something between dragoons and cuirassiers. Outside of French use, they were not very common. I expect they were an anachronism from an era when cavalry could ride around in circles firing their carbines, something I'm not aware of them ever doing in the Napoleonic Wars, although there are some rare examples of these troops firing their weapons from horseback against other cavalry. The dragoons were normally classed as medium cavalry, smaller than the cuirassiers but larger than everything else. There was some variation, such as light dragoons. However, the British light dragoons often use horses as large as heavy cavalry horses, so I suppose it refers to the height of the cavalryman in that particular case. The dragoons were armed with a carbine and standard length straight sword. Originally mounted infantry, they were instead used as a medium cavalry during the Napoleonic Wars. Medium-sized horses used as general-purpose cavalry while retaining the carbine for fire combat. Carbine-armed cavalry were often mixed in with other cavalry, but this class had everyone armed accordingly. As far as I can work out, these were low-cost heavy cavalry, fulfilling heavy cavalry roles at a lower cost than, let's say, a cuirassier, and able to be used in loose formation as well as retaining fire combat capabilities, which would normally only be useful against other cavalry. They often were used where you would expect light cavalry, so they were a form of general-purpose cavalry which could fit both roles. The chevaliers justes were literally light cavalry and described a wide range of light cavalry, from sword-armed or lancer-armed cavalry. Being light, the horses were smaller, and I assume the troopers were as well. The French often used this term for special lancer-armed cavalry. They were also equipped with a curved sword, but the lance was the main weapon, and they were used as lancers, by the French at least. Lance-armed cavalry, while it was also used in a traditional light cavalry role, also attempted to give light cavalry a special punch when meeting other cavalry, similar to the objective of heavy or medium cavalry. I suspect there were two types of lancer-armed cavalry, the true light cavalry and that which was supposed to engage other cavalry. The Austrian chevaliers justes were sword-armed light cavalry. The sword was a curved sword, optimal for striking down infantry. I expect these were used in a similar manner to hussars. Chasseur, French for hunter, described among many nationalities light cavalry, normally called chasseurs justes cheval. These troops were light cavalry, smaller horses and smaller men, I assumed, and equipped in a similar manner to hussars, which means curved swords. They were equipped with a carbine. As they were hunters, that probably makes a lot of sense. They were mainly used for reconnaissance and I assume pursuit. Only the French and I think the Belgians used them. The hussars were light cavalry, smaller horses and probably smaller men, although the British hussars seemed to have unusually large horses, as with all British cavalry. As Britain was unusually well equipped with horses, this was no surprise. The main weapon was the curved sword, good for striking down men on foot. There are examples of these troops doing well against even heavy cavalry, as long as it was in loose order. In compact order, there are examples of these horsemen doing very badly against cuirassiers. There was one rather good account of a British hussar suffering terribly against compact French cuirassiers, with the only tactic being adopted was there was an attempt to hit the flanks as the frontal attack was not going anywhere. Most nationalities possessed hussars. Uhlans were lancers, light cavalry and mainly armed with a lance, but also possessing a curved sword and it seems a pistol. The lance was a surprisingly difficult weapon to master, with inexperienced troops basically being useless. Experienced lancers were very effective in the initial impact, but suffered badly against heavy cavalry in any continued melee. While there are many accounts of this troop type doing badly against armoured cuirassiers, if the opponent was unarmoured, they could be very effective indeed. Surprisingly, they were not effective in breaking squares, but once broken, they seemed to be effective in pursuing routing enemy on foot. I'm not sure if they mainly used the lance or if they used their curved sword, but they were very effective in this role. I think another way of looking at lancers were that these were the battle cavalry of the light cavalry class, with the same benefits all light cavalry possess, but the ability of having some initial melee battle advantage. The Simple lances were cavalry armed with a lance, and we've already covered them with the previous cavalry classes. So all the rest of the lance armed cavalry would be referred to as simple lances unless they had a special name like uhlans or chevaleres. The Prussian Landwehr cavalry were probably the most numerous of this class of troops, and I'm uncertain how effective they were as this weapon took a lot of skill. The Prussian Landwehr cavalry may have operated in a compact formation more than other lance-armed cavalry. The poor old Landwehr were also used rather small horses, having lost all the good mounts to the French. The light dragoons were a bit of a puzzle to me. They seemed to use a curved sword, and I'm uncertain if it was equipped with a carbine. In British service, it was mainly used for reconnaissance, so I'd probably class this more as a hussar. On the other hand, it used rather large horses, so may have been rather formidable even in a frontal melee. This cavalry is supposed to be light cavalry, but under British command or under British service, I'd probably class them closer as medium cavalry. This shows a list of the cavalry used by the Austrians during the Napoleonic Wars. The Austrian cuirassiers only had a frontal plate and often did not wear a cuirass at all, such as I think in 1812. However, when fighting got serious, the cuirass became more common. This list comes from an army list from a set of rules, but it shows you the main cavalry types of the French. The guard and line lancers may have been similarly armed, but the guards, of course, getting better equipment, conditions, etc. The whole topic of guards and elite troops warrants a video in its own right, so will not be covered in this video. The Prussian cavalry types are listed here, but as this comes from an army list, they differentiate between Leib hussars and hussars, which as far as I can work out is mainly a difference or morale difference. The Russians had one unique cavalry type, the Cossack. The bulk of Cossacks were armed with rather long lances, a curved sword, and in some cases a pistol, but could be better classed as irregular cavalry. On the other hand, there are a good number of accounts where they fought reasonably well and in an organised manner, so I suppose they were an unusual type of lancer-armed light cavalry. The light dragoons seem to be a form of light cavalry, while the heavy dragoons, more standard dragoons. The British had very good horses, so I expect their heavy dragoons may have been closer to heavy cavalry. The household guards may have been the closest to cuirassiers. There were accounts some used the cuirass in the early war periods, but I understand this was not normal, and while they did adopt the cuirass after the war in some situations, I suspect it was not used much during the war. The height of horses seemed to be the main factor in whether cavalry was heavy or light, the weapon types being the other. So the cuirassier and dragoons used a straight sword, which was good for fighting in close formation, to an enemy to your front, and the hussars used a curved weapon, which was good when fighting from the side in a loose formation. According to order issued on October 28, 1802, the horses for French cuirassiers and dragoons were to be between 15¼ and 15½ hands tall. After the war in 1805, the minimum height for horses were relaxed, even for cuirassiers. But when Prussian and Austrian horses were captured and new territories annexed, the requirements were heightened. In 1812, the height of horses were as follows: cuirassiers and carbineers, 155 to 160 centimetres, dragoon and artillery, 153 to 155 centimetres, chasseurs and hussars, 149 to 153 centimetres, household lancers, 146 to 150 centimetres, Polish uhlans, 142 to 153 centimetres, and Polish karakusy, 137 centimetres to 142 centimetres, nicknamed by Napoleon my pygmy cavalry. The next thing to cover is the formation. The recommended compact frontal formation frontage per horse was about 1 metre, according to the French. The British suggested 6-inch clearance from stirrup to stirrup, which was probably also pretty close to 1 metre, depending on the horse, of course. This shows a painting of French heavy cavalry, cuirassiers, post-1810, most likely charging. There is not much room between men in this particular case. Here we see hussars meeting what appears to be heavy cavalry, perhaps dragoons, although the swords seem curved, so I'm uncertain. I wonder if they're British light dragoons. While it's hard to see clearly, it seems hussars are adopting a compact formation. It does look a bit looser than the previous painting, but not by much, and I could be wrong as it's difficult to determine distances in a painting. I suspect victory would go to the side with the larger horses and the greater reach. If both sides had a curved source, the reach would be about the same. So it's all about the horses and the skill of the troops. I'd put my money on the hussars in this particular case, or the previous painting's case anyway. This is a better painting of light cavalry in a compact formation, British hussars by the looks of it. This looks like a reasonably compact formation with at least 3 ranks of cavalry, although the third rank is hard to see and may be part of another squadron. This shows lancers charging in a compact formation. I would suspect lancers of all the light cavalry would prefer a compact formation charge. Lance was the most dangerous in the first contact during line versus line combats. The long weapon allowed cavalrymen to wound or kill an enemy armed with a shorter weapon first. Once the enemy got past the point of the lance, then the lancers were very vulnerable. General Jomy wrote that the lance is the most aggressive weapon, as one can simply outreach every opponent. This shows what's clearly a stage painting, as it shows what could be the preferred tactic of light cavalry, fighting from the side and using the manoeuvrability and flexibility of the smaller horses and curved weapon to basically gain an advantage against any opponent. This provides a better view of what fighting in a loose formation could have looked like in terms of frontage. If you could define this type of fighting in this manner, which would probably range from 2 to 3 metres per horse frontage, allowing for room to get around to the side and use speed to overwhelm a heavier opponent, would be probably the preferred tactics of the light cavalry. Light cavalry, if they caught heavy cavalry in such a situation, would have a significant advantage. Of course, this would mainly occur if the heavy cavalry was hit in the flank or rear, or was pursuing or routing something else. Here we see lancers or uhlans running down infantry. Once the infantry formations had broken, or if hit in the flank, rear, or while in line formation, light cavalry would have a field day. Heavy cavalry would be as effective, but as it was rarer and probably reserved for the all-important cavalry versus cavalry conflicts, I suspect a general would not encourage this type of behaviour for their heavy cavalry. This shows why cavalry had such a hard time breaking a square. A single cavalryman, irrespective of type, would be meeting 6 foot, all about to use bayonets and musket fire to deal with the cavalry. It mattered little if the cavalry was a cuirassier or lancer. The odds were heavily in favour of the foot. If the infantry was dispersed, it mattered little if the cavalry was light or heavily. Possibly lancer-armed light cavalry would be most effective, although the cuirassier may have felt safer behind his breastplate and thus been more daring. The only issue with that particular theory is a musket ball would be more likely to hit the horse anyway, so maybe it's not so much of a difference. I think it mattered little what type of cavalry was attacking the square. It was always going to be extremely difficult to break it. Unless the infantry was in very poor morale, it needed to be broken or disordered before any cavalry would be effective, and pretty much any kind of cavalry would be quite effective. However, the few times cavalry did break a square, it was a result of heavy cavalry, a few cases of lancers, and a very, very few cases of other light cavalry. So I suppose if the infantry had poor morale, or it was going to be broken, it was probably more likely going to occur by a charge, as a result of a charge by heavy cavalry. Let's look about artillery, which was the most effective against cavalry, and also infantry and square. Basically, once the cavalry came to grips with the artillery, it was over Red Rover, and it mattered little if the cavalry was light or heavy. However, coming into contact was a different story. The light cavalry would have had the advantage as they were faster and smaller. The other key factor is they probably adopted a looser formation, something heavy cavalry would not do so unless there was no enemy light cavalry around and there was no choice. Attacking artillery seemed to favour the light cavalry. In the end, the main conclusion I've come to is that heavy cavalry's main job was to defeat opposing cavalry. While in this painting the cuirassier is probably going to lose as he's not in compact formation, this is probably what the heavy cavalry spent most of its time doing. The light cavalry did everything else, although the lance in many cases also relied a great deal on compact formations to achieve its ends. I have to admit that there were cases, particularly the French, where heavy cavalry did attack enemy infantry. So in some cases that's probably the secondary task of heavy cavalry. The basic cavalry formation was a squadron, which was designed to charge or fight in two ranks. I think each rank was sometimes referred to as a half squadron or company, but the references are unclear. Each company was made up of 2 platoons. Each squadron ranged in size from 72 to 250 men, although 140 was the average strength of the French. It seems squadrons would be disbanded and distributed to ensure each squadron had a minimum number of effective men. This shows the standard formation adopted by the squadron, which is a line with 2 ranks. The cavalry was formed either in lines, echelons, or columns. Cavalry formations. The echelon formation was easier formation to manoeuvre, and the direction of the advance could be swiftly changed. There were echelons by squadron, by regiment, by brigade, and even by entire divisions. The interesting takeaway is a squadron of 120 men occupied a frontage of about 70 metres, which means a 4-squadron regiment had a frontage of 280 metres. But any gaps between squadrons, which averaged about 10 metres, should also be factored in. This makes it about 300 metres. This was, of course, in a compact formation. Light cavalry and some form of loose formation would have a much greater frontage if they desired, although I expect they would adopt a deeper formation rather than expand out by a factor of 2 or 3. Carbine-armed cavalry could give a good account of themselves, as can be seen in this description of a cavalry action at Friedland. Some of the cavalry fights on the northern part of the battlefield at Friedland, here described by Cornet V.F. Bulgarian of the Grand Duke Constantine Ulan Regiment. One squadron of Ulans under Shkevozh stood near 2 light guns. This little cannonade went for a while before a column of French cavalry went out of the woods. The front of this column was not too wide, but its depth was unknown to the Uhlans. According to Bulgarian, 2 squadrons of Uhlans and 1 squadron of Light Guard Cossacks advanced against the enemy. The Uhlans moved in column by platoons. Each squadron had 4 platoons, and with intervals on the distance of platoons, passed through a village, formed by squadrons, and then rushed forward with loud battle cries. Shevogov rode in the front with outstretched sabre. The column of French dragoons then halted and stood motionless like a stone wall waiting for the Russians. The dragoons from the second rank grabbed their muskets and began firing, while those in the front rank drew sabres and waited. The charging Uhlans first slowed down and then halted. The French shouted massively, "Avant, viva l'Empereur," pardon my French, and advanced towards en masse. The Uhlans and Cossacks gave way before the sheer weight of the column. Their retreat was covered by flankers who opened fire on the pursuing dragoons. These other quotes from various sources also indicate the importance of maintaining a compact formation while engaging in melee combat against opposing cavalry. The fast pace, however, disordered the troops. Gaps were created. Horses in the centres were squeezed out. Slower horses and some cowards were left behind. Soon the troops charged into a noisy horde. If they met a well-aligned troop advancing at a slow, steady pace, they were lost. Only the battle-hardened and disciplined troops that managed to advance in a slower, steady pace. They sped up gradually and kept good order until the very last moment when officers ordered them to gallop. Gallop was the winning intoxication gait, with little time for second thought. Experience has shown that the best distance from the enemy to begin the gallop is between 250 paces. This gradual increase of speed is very important to prevent the horses from being completely blown on reaching the enemy. This description from Reichenbach in 1813 shows cavalry engagements were often a game of chicken, but more importantly, once order had been lost, so had any chance of victory. Then another regiment of Russian Uhlans appeared and advanced toward us in line, but when it was still 500 paces away, it broke into a gallop. Dezonek, a subordinate, again wanted us to countercharge. Zherovsky, another subordinate, who knew the general very well, told him that there was no point in charging, as the enemy had begun to gallop far too soon. They would soon lose formation and would never reach us. Sure enough, their lines shortly broke up, a few dozen pulled ahead, and the majority began to slow down. No one came any closer to us than 100 paces. It's difficult to estimate just how many charges were decided without the two sides actually meeting. Expert on cavalry, Ardant du Apic stated, with some exaggeration just to make a point, that in 49 of 50 cases, one side hesitated disordered, and fled before contact was made. Approximately 75% of the time this will happen at a distance, before they can even see each other's eyes. Already in the 18th century, Mirabeau wrote that veteran cavalry officers have told us that when two bodies of cavalry charge one another, it almost always happens that one party flees before the other can meet it. Sabre blows are dealt only during the pursuit. Often they will get closer, but even in these few cases, when both sides collide, there was no shock at full speed, but a half face-to-face and then engagement. I assume this was light cavalry. What does puzzle me the most is this following quote. If both sides were of equal morale, then the horsemen would pass through each other's formation and come out on the other side. Sometimes they would continue forward until they were overthrown by the second line of enemy cavalry. I'm uncertain how this would occur if the cavalry were in a compact formation. Perhaps this indicates light cavalry would adopt a looser formation in a charge. As hussars delivered their main attack from the side, I suppose this makes sense. However, I can't find any official military document which states this to be the official sort of formation to use for light cavalry charges. I suspect the quote has to be interpreted as when in compact formation there was no passing through each other's line. Only in loose formation, possibly caused by the disorder of a charge, would formations pass through each other. According to Dupic, there were frequent instances where two lines of cavalry would confront each other without dodging, each waiting for the other to retire or make a mistake. It was the case where troops on both sides were of equal bravery and determination that this occurred. In 1813, two Russian and two Polish regiments charged each other. When close enough to recognize faces, they slackened their gait, and after a while both turned their backs and retreated. Similar situation, according to Dupic, can be observed between two dogs, cats or lions, when the courage is equal. In 1812 at Villadrigo, the French and British cavalry attacked each other and had a prolonged fight, which was only 10 minutes. Then came one more French regiment, which got around one flank and rolled the British up. So 10 minutes was considered a prolonged fight. While cuirassiers and lancers could be considered as cavalry specifically designed to deal with enemy cavalry, the lancers did not fare well against cuirassiers. Apart from an example in 1813 at Leipzig, the lancers normally were unable to prevail against cuirassiers. Thus, I expect the lancers were the poor man's anti-cavalry force. This could be why the Prussians armed their Landwehr with lance in an attempt to give their cavalry the edge required to prevail against enemy light cavalry. Considering their general inferiority in cavalry, or horses, in the latter period of the war, this probably makes sense. Let's look at some conclusions. The first one is density. We know cavalry averaged 50 centimetres per horse in compact formation, which was 2 ranks of horse at 1 metre per horse frontage. The equivalent density of line infantry was 22 centimetres per man, or for the British 33 centimetres per man. Remember the rear ranks. This explains why WRG rules, for example, which uses common base widths, bases 4 line infantry to a base and 2 cavalry to a base. This does represent the correct ratio, one which other rules do continue to adopt. This is annoying because I'm used to basing my lights at 2 to a base and my medium heavy at 3 to a base. I will now need to base all my cavalry 2 to a base. I actually have no idea what a loose formation density would look like. It must be at least 2 metres per horse to allow light cavalry to get around the side of the his opponent, which is probably the most likely frontage. The real question is, did the formation width increase, or was there simply an increase in depth? I suspect a combination of both, but mainly depth. The other issue was, would this only have been adopted when facing opponents which also adopted a loose formation? Taking on 2 enemy cuirassiers with a single hussar or even ulan was not something that was ever going to occur. Thus, I have to assume loose formation is more a state, such as disordered, than a standard and commonly adopted formation. The conclusion is this is better handled in the rules mechanics rather than probably basing. The same could be the case with skirmishing formations, something I've not yet covered in this video. The depth would increase rather than width, although with skirmishing part of the objective is to use the firearms, so maybe this would vary. If you're going to use firearms, the width probably doubled, but skirmishing formation is not used to melee, so let's bypass the whole topic of skirmish formations for the moment. We know heavy and medium cavalry, as well as most lancers, needed to remain in compact formation, but we know lighter cavalry often did not, either by accident or on purpose. Thus we need a way to depict this, which is where different basing may be useful. Heavies and lancer arm cavalry, which were primarily designed for cavalry versus cavalry action, could be depicted by putting 3 to a base. Light cavalry could remain 2. Another option is to keep the heavies at 2 per base, the light to 1, but this doesn't look very good, so it probably wouldn't be done. The other factor to consider is rules will often provide a different scale for infantry versus cavalry, so WRG uses 50 to 1 for infantry and 40 to 1 for cavalry. Thus 3 by 40 cavalry equals 120 cavalry, which would have a frontage of 60 metres, while 4 by 50 foot equals 200 men, which would have a frontage of 40 metres. 2 cavalry per base would have a frontage of 40 metres, so it's actually the closest match and probably what we should stay with. My final conclusion is all cavalry should be based 2 per base, with infantry 4 per base. On the other hand, having a 3 cavalry base could be used to depict compact formation cavalry, assuming this was even important in the rules, so it really depends on the rules. This is rather annoying, as now I may be forced to rebase all my cavalry. Damn. I now wish I did not do this analysis. If I adopt an infantry scale of 1 in 250 and a cavalry scale of 1 in 175, then some sort of middle ground could be arrived at. The only issue with this is that there will be too many light cavalry elements and not enough heavy cavalry elements. In conclusion, it's rebasing time, most annoying as I've indicated earlier. I decided to go back to DBN to check the scale because they used a different cavalry basing, and when I checked the scale of DBN, there's no realistic scale ratios which I could use. DBN is element based, so the number of figures on an element simply tells you what the element is, not its true troop density. The same is the case for ancients in the most part, which is where probably DBN got the idea from, I expect. That is the idea of having different densities on the base to reflect different cavalry types. One interesting point which did come from this analysis was base width. I commonly always use a base width of 4 centimeters for 15mm figures these days, but used to use the WRG 3 centimeter base wide bases in the past. The base width change when figures move from 15mm to something closer to 18mm, thus making it difficult to base 3 centimeter on a 3 centimeter base. If you possess true 15mm figures, a base width of 3 centimeters is probably optimal. But if you're using 18mm infantry, it becomes very difficult to fit them on a 3 centimeter wide base. In the end, I'm going to stay with 4 centimeter bases, even if the cavalry are not historically depicted stirrup to stirrup. It allows me to place more diorama on the figures, but for players who only use 15mm figures and do not plan on purchasing 18mm, then you could possibly go down the path of a 3 centimeter wide base. This shows my final conclusion based on the cavalry types and how they differ from each other. I do not pretend this is complete and accurate, but may provide some idea of the differences between cavalry types. And so we come to the end of my episode 45, my video series on game design theory, in this case a specific analysis of cavalry during the Napoleonic period. Now I'm off to start rebasing my Napoleon figures. Actually, I've already completed all my rebasing, and I'm actually rebasing, or I'm not rebasing, I'm now creating a new force mix using US basing sizes, which is a whole new can of worms. Anyway, I recommend the military history visualized video titled Napoleonic Cavalry Combat and Tactics on YouTube, and the excellent www.napoleon.com site. Link is shown in the description if you want a bit more information about cavalry and how you may use cavalry and base them. Denken Sie da immer vorhin, Heimaten zu kämpfen.